Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're meeting with Lucy Johnstone. Lucy is a consultant clinical psychologist, and she was the lead author, along with Professor Mary Boyle, for the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which was published in 2018, and it's a British Psychological Society publication co-produced with service users, which outlines a conceptual alternative to psychiatric diagnosis, and it has attracted national and international attention. Lucy is a very experienced conference speaker and lecturer, and she currently works as an independent trainer, but she's also author of Users and Abusers of Psychiatry, and also A Straight Talking Guide to Psychiatric Diagnosis, and she's the co-editor of Formulation in Psychology and Psychotherapy, amongst other things. I'm really pleased that you could join us today, Lucy. Welcome. Pleased to be here.
Hello there, Lucy. Very nice to meet you. You're very well known for many things, of course, but perhaps most recently for your connections to the Power Threat Meaning Framework. Can you tell us something about what this is for those of us who perhaps don't know so much about it?
Yes, very happy to. So the Power Threat Meaning Framework is a joint attempt, for which I and Mary Boyle were the lead authors, to outline a conceptual alternative to the diagnostic model of distress. In other words, to think about moving away from the understanding, which is very widely held, that various forms of distress, which of course are very real, are best understood by giving them diagnostic labels and perhaps intervening mainly with medication, you know, in the context of hospitals and doctors and nurses and all the rest of it. So it seems to us that this model is, and has never had been evidenced, that actually there are signs of it crumbling, that there are a number of alternatives around already, and that we wanted to make a ridiculously ambitious attempt to outline, or at least make an attempt to outline, what the alternative principles might be if we want to move right away from a diagnostically based world, which affects so many of the systems in which we live, not just mental health, not just criminal justice system, but the welfare system, the legal system, and how we as ordinary people in everyday language think about our inevitable experiences of distress as we go through life. So it's quite dense and academic in its original version. I think we're going to have links at the end. There are a number of accessible versions of it too on the main British Psychological Society website. And because diagnosis is so deeply embedded in various ways in our society, and indeed across westernised societies, it has quite wide implications. But what it isn't is a manual to say, do this instead, do this instead, do this instead. It's a set of ideas which we very much wanted people to be interested in fleshing out in their own settings, in which they're experts, both within services and beyond services. And also what it isn't is saying everything you're doing is wrong, stop that and do this instead. One of its main aims is to support the widespread use of very good practice, which is not based on diagnostic principles, which already exists, give it extra evidence, extra support, perhaps, and extra ideas about ways forward. That's it, as briefly as I can put it, but that's a lot briefer than reading the main 458-page document.
Thank you very much. I mean, just from that brief description there, Lucy, I can tell that this is a set of ideas which immediately are set up to challenge some existing power structures, and we'll probably come on to that later on. But I wonder if you can expand just a bit more and tell us what the core themes are.
Definitely. So I'm sure a lot of listeners will have heard of the common slogan which comes from trauma-informed practice, which is, instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. That's one very good way of summing it up. The framework draws a lot on trauma-informed practice, although it's wider than that. In a nutshell, the other way I usually describe it very briefly is that we're suggesting that instead of diagnostic practice and understandings, we need narrative practice and understandings. And if we're psychologists, we're very used to using narrative in a particular form called formulation, which I've done a lot of writing and practicing and training and teaching and researching about in my career. But the framework is wider than that because it actually welcomes any type of narrative, verbal, non-verbal, dance, singing, theatre, poetry, all sorts of ways that people find to express and very often heal through narrative. And the other main theme really is that these narratives need to make the links with wider social, political and economic contexts and kind of ideological meanings, by which we mean the norms and expectations very often unchallenged in any given society and culture. So these are to some extent likely to be more individual narratives, particularly in more individualistic societies like ours. But actually, what we ultimately hope to show is the links between personal distress and wider contexts of social injustice and inequality. And we need narratives to make those links. And that's ultimately the only way we believe of making sense of distress in a way that will finally move us away from a narrow diagnostic model. And that also implies, the third thing I'd always say about the framework is it's about all of us. We don't believe there's some cut-off between people who are supposedly mentally ill and well, people who are supposedly normal and abnormal. We all experience distress at times. We all find ways of making sense of our distress. We all find ways to survive. So the framework is very much about all of us.
Sounds a bit, Lucy, like trying to make sure that we all recognise as a society that we have a responsibility to each other's well-being.
That's true, yes. So the interventions, individual interventions are always going to be helpful and supportive and necessary for many, perhaps most of us. But if we want to look at the roots of distress, we can't just go on addressing problems purely at an individual level. Like someone whose name I can't remember said, we don't want to just fish people out of the water, or we want to go upstream and find out where they're falling in. And I think we're very much seeing what happens when you don't do that in our society at the moment. We're reaching a point rapidly where I think everyone is going to qualify for the diagnosis. We don't yet seem to really reach the point where we're thinking and asking, as we should be, well, why are so many people distressed in the first place? Yeah, we do need to do that.
Thank you very much. So how did it all come about? Whose idea was it?
It was a complete accident, as some of the best things are, and indeed everything in my career has been something that happened to me, possibly indicating something wrong with me, I don't know. So the core authors, 8 of us, are people who've known each other for many years, decades in fact. I think I've known Mary Boyle, the other lead author, for over 30 years. So we were always in loose contact with each other. And we happened to be together to do some recording in Manchester in November 2012. And one of us, I think I may have to take the blame for this, said, what would it be like to outline a conceptual alternative to the diagnostic model? So that wasn't a new idea for us. From our shared clinical academic research and lived experience perspectives, none of us had ever believed in that model. But when you start asking in a really serious way, well, what would an alternative look like? It turned out to be kind of extraordinarily challenging, even for us obsessives who've been thinking about it for up to 30 years. So it kind of intrigued us. And 4 hours later, we were still sitting in this hotel room throwing ideas around. So then we thought, well, let's see if we can put some of this down on paper. And then it became obvious that actually we needed some support with this. We initially thought this will be an independent project. Nobody's going to tell us what to do. We're fed up of people telling us what we can and can't say or write. However, it became necessary and actually in the long term very helpful to get support from the British Psychological Society. It's in fact from the DCP, the Division of Clinical Psychology, who funded our meetings, who gave us a certain amount of money to pay a researcher and so on. And to be fair to them, they placed no restrictions on what we could say, and they've published the documents for free, which is very generous. They've made it widely accessible and credible because it has their stamp on it in a way that it wouldn't otherwise have been. Although I must emphasise it's not an official BPS or DCP approach. No psychologists have to use it, and it's meant to be open to anyone from any background or no professional background. So that's how it happened. It took 5 years. It was a nightmare process, and I sometimes say It's a bit like having kids. If you knew what it was going to involve, you'd never do it in the first place. But of course, at the other end, you'd never without your lovely, lovely kids. But my God, you don't necessarily know what you're taking on. And we spent a long time thinking, what the hell are we doing? We've emerged the other end, I think, with something imperfect, evolving, but something we actually feel very proud of.
Probably also worth saying here for everybody listening that we will share links in our show notes and also with the transcript on Substack to all. And Lucy's kindly shared many links to really interesting, useful information, and we'll make sure that you can access all of that stuff.
Yeah, so thanks very much for that, Lucy. So you've mentioned that there were 8 authors altogether, but I was looking through the documents earlier on today, and I could see that it wasn't just 8 authors. That, in fact, you involved dozens and dozens of people in various layers. You know, you've got experts by experience. I think there are critics in there. Could you say a bit about that, how you developed that style of working and having your work critiqued?
Yeah, well, that's something that kind of just happened, if you like. So the people in the room who became the core of the group include psychologists and survivors, Jackie Dillon and Ella Longdon. The larger project group ended up being about 40 people, about a third of whom had personal experience of receiving mental health or psychiatric care. So as you say, that included people with lived experience, people with experience in particular areas, people who had a critical perspective on issues like kind of race and gender and so on. And together, I think it made quite a powerful team.
Thank you. So can you say something about how it's been used in forensic settings?
Yes, I will. I've been... my job was unexpected to become offering training and consultancy in the framework, which I never expected it to be. But it's, very rewarding and fun to do. So I quite often do joint training. I'm not a forensic psychologist, but in relation to forensic settings where there's been a lot of interest, which, very, very welcome. I've done most of my training with Dr. Jo Ramsden, who, as you probably know, is a clinical lead for personality disorder services in Humberside, though that's not a term that she would personally use or advocate for. So together we bring our kind of shared expertise to... I think we've done a number of joint training events now, partly to probation teams or prison teams, and most interestingly recently to several hundred people who were involved in writing parole reports. So that was a particular way of working with them, not telling them, but working with them to think about how might you structure a parole report along PTMF lines. Would that work? Let's try it out. Let us know. Did seem to go down well, so we were asked to do another training day. That's not something the framework has any particular ideas about, but I think it's a very good example of how the principles can be adapted alongside people working in the setting and their expertise and tried out and experimented with and can feed back into the ongoing development of the framework. So getting the framework structure into parole reports is not only, I hope, useful, but quite a powerful systemic intervention, to be honest. So Jo and I are certainly open to further invitations.
Thank you. And has most of that work been done with psychologists, or have you been able to involve other members of the multidisciplinary team when there is one?
No, lots of people. And it depends who asks us. Sometimes it's a probation or psychology team, sometimes it isn't, sometimes it's a whole team, sometimes it's anyone who's writing parole reports. So we're open to all comers.
Thank you.
Lucy, how was the PTMF initially received when it was first launched?
That's an interesting question, and it's something we did not think about at all, because it's sort of, we're sometimes accused of having some evil plan to take over the world of the PTMF framework, and it's so far from the truth. This was a subject of passionate intellectual and personal interest, which in a sense we did just because we really, really, really wanted to. It really intrigued and challenged us, and in a sense, had no one ever read it, I think we'd have still been happy we'd done it. So we had no plans, no thoughts, no real sense about how it's going to be received, although it is the case that even before it was published and before anyone had read a word of it, there were a number of people on social media priming other people to say that something terrible is on the way and it's outrageous and it's unevidenced and it's excluded survivors and etc., etc., etc. So there was immediately a very strong reaction, mostly positive, I have to say. I think about 12 blogs in the first 2 weeks, of which 3 were overtly hostile and 9 were very supportive. And it's kind of blossomed since then. We're now in a situation where we have 7 translations of the documents. And, I've travelled all over the world, as have some of the other members of the author group and of the Power Threat Meaning Framework Committee, which collates resources for the website and receives training requests and helps to develop the framework further. So it's succeeded beyond our wildest dreams, I would say. But very much our plan was and still is we respond to requests. We're not about pushing anything. All of us in the author group have spent our lives banging our heads against systems that are not likely to change. I dare say you know that feeling. Mm-hmm. In this rather late stage of our careers, we've decided, well, we'll go where people are interested and we'll do what, and we'll, talk to people who want to hear. And other people are entirely free to disagree. That's entirely up to them.
I think it's so interesting how firstly, I think it's really interesting that 7 translations, because that speaks of a hunger for an alternative to diagnostic manuals, which we all know are very seriously put together anyway. But I think the other thing that's really interesting, Lucy, is the careful and deliberate manner in which you talk about it. So even right at the start of this conversation with David, when he asked you what it was, there was a lot of preamble about what it isn't, in terms of not telling other people what to do, and that trying to respect different people's perspectives, and then it's just, it is an opinion, and it's a philosophical proposal put out there for people to think about. But I suppose what that speaks of is the fact that it has been controversial. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on why it's been so controversial, why there has been these, as you say, in the first fortnight, these 3 blogs and this fear before it was published. But what's that about?
Well, very interesting. I mean, the framework talks, as you know, a lot about power. One of the core things we think the framework adds to our understandings is a really, really detailed understanding of the role of power in all its guises, hence power, threat meaning framework, power first and foremost, power being what is almost by definition excluded from diagnostic understandings, and to be fair, narrow psychological and psychotherapeutic ones as well. So there's a great deal of power invested in the current diagnostic system, isn't there, at all levels? People's identities, people's status, people's professional backgrounds, drug companies, people who promote social policy and find it easier to blame the consequences of social policy on people's personal deficits and so on. We are posing a threat to power, and we wanted to kind of... when I do my training, I always say 2 things. Well, I say lots of things, but these 2 things I particularly say. One is the framework is a very idealistic document. It's looking for a world where we've completely left behind this failed medical paradigm in relation to distress. 2, we have to start where we are, and in training and in our real life settings, we need to be realistic and do what we can with what we have, starting where we are. But nevertheless, the way you've written it, I can see how it's threatening. I mean, I don't think that justifies some of the responses we've had, given that, as you clearly say, we always say you don't have to like it, read it, agree with it, or do anything with it. But I think another aspect of it, inevitably, is that people's identities are very tied up with diagnostic understandings, aren't they? I think nowadays, more than ever, people, things like ADHD and ASD and other terms I probably wouldn't use have become identities as much as, or as more as labels. And a threat to an identity is always difficult to hear. And if people want to identify in that way, 100% fine by us. But actually, I think these things are intrinsically threatening questions to pose.
In terms of people who are threatened, it sounded like you were talking partly about people with lived experience who might wish to retain their diagnostic label. But I wondered in terms of professional groups, there's one group in particular that might stand out as being likely to perhaps find it a bit threatening and challenging, but I wondered if that is the case, is that a stereotype? And
yes, it is a bit of a stereotype. I'm always quite keen to say, psychiatrists are not the people who've necessarily leapt in to kind of demolish this, because actually we've been very much welcomed by a lot of psychiatrists. I've done quite a few invited presentations to groups consisting partly or entirely of psychiatrists. You probably know of the Critical Psychiatry Network in the UK, who've been very, very welcoming, and indeed we've cited some of their work in the framework. So it cuts across professional bodies. Some psychologists have been really overtly hostile. Social workers have almost entirely welcomed it, as you'd expect. It's very much in line with social work thinking. And the service users are quite split on it. Some have found it enormously liberating and welcome and empowering. Some, really don't like it at all, and that's their perspective. So it isn't really about professional groupings. And one of the more destructive ways that people tried to spin it originally was this is psychologists attacking psychiatrists. And, the people knew how cynical I am about many aspects of my own profession. And the same would be true of all the other psychologist authors of PTMF. They would see how implausible that is. It's really not about that. It's about ways of thinking which cross professional boundaries.
Did you realise it was going to be considered so radical at the time that it came out?
Kind of yes and no, yeah, because I have held very similar ideas for my whole long career, and so I'm used to being thought of as some extremist with bizarre ideas. So you get a lot of other extremists with bizarre ideas and put them down. I guess we knew that it's going to be seen as radical. Although that also is interesting because along with the "this is too extreme, this is too difficult to read" response, we've also had the other commonest responses, "Isn't this really just common sense?" And I actually think that's true. It's a long, complicated document with 67 pages of references. Sometimes I think you have to go a very long way round to re-establish common sense. But, an ordinary person in the street can grasp very quickly. People who've had very difficult lives are those who are more likely to struggle. It actually is, at a core level, common sense.
Which I suppose you've kind of always been championing. I remember when I was newly qualified and you were talking about formulation, and that seemed to be what clinical psychologists were trained to do, to provide formulation. But even then, it seemed like you're talking about this concept, which some people are finding it quite hard to hear about, even though it's the root of our profession, surely.
Well, indeed, it depends a bit what you mean by formulation, because in our profession, name is Good Practice Guidelines, 2011, for which I was the lead author. We defined them as an alternative to diagnosis, not an addition to. So an addition to, flesh out the label, is not controversial. An alternative to is controversial. But that is actually what our professional guidelines say.
That's quite a useful way of explaining the controversy there, I think.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on the podcast, Lucy, was because I've seen online quite a lot of hateful language used about you and others connected to the document. And to wonder about. That's without going out of my way to look for it. Just happened across that. What kind of character assassinations have you been subjected to? So great.
I've been the most high-profile social media person. Deliberately, that was the part I thought, well, I'm quite experienced on Twitter. I know how to handle this stuff. I was wrong. It was worse than I ever expected. So most of that has been directed at me personally. I have to say, when I've presented in person, I've never had anything, I'm not saying everyone agrees. I've never had anything remotely like that. So I don't want to it's hard to know how representative these voices are. A small number of people with loud voices, I suspect. But it's been astonishingly unpleasant in some ways. And misogynistic, really. There've been a lot of blatant lies, like apparently I've bullied some service users so badly they've been sectioned and had to leave Twitter, apparently. And apparently, if anyone criticises the framework, I issue some kind of legal threat against them. Well, I wish I had the money to issue Legal sanctions, I must say. But in relation to me and Mary as the lead authors, there appears to be something particularly challenging for some, need I say it, male professionals tweeting under their own name, who have made very unpleasant, highly sexualised, misogynistic comments about, it's all our misdirected libido that's persuaded us to write this terrible document. It astonishes me how people think that, what do people think? Professionals tweeting under their own name. What impressions do they think they're giving? One of the most notorious is a psychologist, I have to say. Scathingly described us as queens and their courtiers, women of a certain age and empresses with no clothes. That's not very nice, is it? Not that I give a damn about it at one level. I mean, again, it shows that you're posing a threat, doesn't it? I mean, it quite depressingly shows the degree of misogyny around. Still, I think I will just mention one recent trend. This goes in trends. You can kind of feel them trying things out to see if this sticks. So the most recent trend is to describe us all as, and these are words that some people are actually using, we're outright, we're fascists, we're supremacists. So the way they try to work that out is because we're trying to replace diagnosis, our secret aim is to prevent people getting access to welfare and benefits, because we're working hand in hand with far-right MPs to kind of disenfranchise people and, instead retreat to our Holly Street clinics and make thousands of pounds out of private therapy. I mean, it's so ludicrous, it's not worth cancelling in a way. But, I mean, that's the kind of latest thing. They're pushing that one at the moment. I mean, the fact that we're all very much on the left. I mean, it's kind of irrelevant in a way. It's a cross-party issue, but I mean, the degree to which that is contradicted by the facts doesn't seem to matter. And it's hard to know how much of this sticks, to be honest, but I suspect for some people, some of it does stick.
But there's some resonance there, isn't there, with other sort of hot potatoes, like the whole issue around the sort of trans people and gender affirming care, and that if you were to pause for a thought in terms of where the origin of those kind of like feelings are, that you're criticised for being on the right of society. So it seems harder and harder to have academic debate where people are free to express an opinion and explore things and see what else might be there, which is a shame.
It's not good.
No. How have you coped with the hate you've experienced? That comment from that psychologist is, that's really hateful and shocking that a professional would think that's okay to write such a thing.
Yeah, I mean, it has been very unpleasant, so I don't want to play that down. But I mean, I do feel very supported, not just by the other authors, but I'm part of a large network of people thinking in similar ways, working in similar ways, and we're very supportive of each other. I mean, I never feel alone with it. So you could even say it's a kind of bonding experience in a way, not a very pleasant one. And there's this famous saying, isn't there? First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you, then you win. I mean, I think there's an intermediate stage just before winning, which is then they assimilate it. Then they say, oh, well, we've always used the framework. It's very helpful for our patients with borderline personality disorder. I'm already seeing a little of that emerging, and that probably can't be avoided. But actually, I think it's better to be attacked than to be ignored. Yeah, yes. Attack shows you're having an impact. I mean, I can tolerate it. It's not going to put me off. It's certainly not going to put any of the other authors off, or any of the other allies and colleagues and friends off. So there we are.
Does that affect your family though? You might be okay with it, but I was thinking, partner, any kids, loved ones, can't be nice for them to also see this happening to you.
No, they probably get fed up with me going on about it. Oh, Mum, I don't know why you're on Twitter anyway. No, it's not nice, but I hope they can also see me not being put off by it, carrying on regardless.
Absolutely horrible, Lucy, and but it's, I suppose, an important reminder of what we know about the human condition, that humanity may well be capable of wonderful and heroic things, but it's also capable of the most base and awful. And much of our history has been spent trying to construct a social structure which contains those most base of instincts. And Twitter, unfortunately, seems to be a valve which lets them all free again.
Yes, that's the trouble. I mean, as a society, we haven't really come to grips with social media, have we? In all sorts of ways, it does need regulating, and it does need more controls imposed.
Thank you very much. So, Lucy, increasingly we see phrases from therapy being extended into non-therapeutic settings, such as trauma-informed, this and that. Is there a role for the PTMF in organisational culture?
Yes, indeed there is. And this is something that Jo Ramsden, who I mentioned earlier, I've done joint training in forensic settings with, is particularly interested. And I think that may be why people working in forensic settings have been attracted towards the framework in a way that I wasn't necessarily expecting, because you can't really work in forensic settings without being aware of the role of power, can you? I mean, forensic settings are about the use of power in a way, aren't they? Hopefully in a way that's protective and supportive and ultimately that will help to rehabilitate people, but often not. So I think that's why it's been attractive. And Jo has a particular interest in the way that power operates in organisations and how organisations can become defensive and can display threat responses and so on, and how we can be aware of that and work so it doesn't undermine, the reason we're in the organisations in the first place. So I've put a link, sent you a link to put in the resources, which is a PTMF document suggesting ways that the framework can apply to organisations, because it's really not meant to be just about individual narratives. Organisations have narratives too. And that document builds on a lot of stuff we already know about, how we can understand trauma reactions at an organisation level as well, can't we, as well as at a personal level. Organisations can be under threat and so on. So yes, I think it's very relevant.
Thank you. So what's next? Do you have a next step?
We never have a next step because, like I said, we'll entirely leave it up to you. We will go where we're invited if it appeals. So I think if you said, how would we like to see things develop in terms of the framework, I think we'd really like to see, well, possibly two things. We've had some interest from public health, but more interest from public health from policymakers. I mean, we do have some links. These things take a while to build up, don't they? And we do have some political links. But actually, we're talking about the root causes of distress. That's the level at which change needs to happen, isn't it? And at the other end of the spectrum, I think we'd also like to see much more availability of alternative non-diagnostic narratives to the general public, because you know how the diagnostic narrative was run rampant recently on TikTok and all sorts of other places. And the second edition of my book on diagnosis, which I think I sent you a link to, was only 7 years after the first one. The first one is in 2014, the second one's in 2020, and the landscape had completely changed. 2014, I was describing psychiatric diagnosis of this unwelcome, stigmatising imposition by a professional. 2020, this desirable identity and commodity which everyone is rushing to apply to themselves. It's quite extraordinary. So I think I'd like to mention another activity I'm involved in. So the framework is an academic, you described it, is a philosophical document, which I think is a very good way of putting it, actually. It's not a campaigning document, and we're not a campaigning group. We're a group that offers training and support and so on, but I am involved in a campaigning group called A Disorder for Everyone, which was founded by my friend and colleague, psychotherapist Jo Watson, which is in a similar way, but in a much more actively campaigning way, saying we need an alternative to the diagnostic model of distress. And we run regular kind of online websites. There's a very good online website to which I've given you the link, which has lots and lots of free resources, lots of very interesting talks, lots of ideas from across the spectrum. We're running our 12-hour online international festival this year on November the 8th, I think it is. I've sent you a link to that. So that is our attempt, and that's the area in which I'm involved in trying to reach out more to the general public. And we have some important allies in that too. So we have some quite well-known authors, for example, Johan Harley, who's wrote which I think is a very good book, Lost Connections, about alternative ways of understanding what we might call depression. Kate Silverton, ex-broadcaster, who's written 2 very good books, I think, about how parents can manage their children, in terms of trauma-informed practice and self-regulation, and hopefully avoid some of the labelling and describing of drugs and so that's going on. So those are areas I think I'd particularly like to see the narrative really continuing to change.
Yeah, it's really good to hear about. Sorry.
I was just going to say thank you for that. I can well understand why you position yourself and the PTMF in such a kind of tactful and delicate manner. But I think it would be really great to see it really floated as an engaged debate, something, and probably you're doing this in any way beneath the surface. Sorry.
Yes, no. Well, what I do and what we all do is we kind of present it very carefully, package it in a particular way, as you both said. But I mean, once I'm there, I'm not going to kind of mince words about what we're saying. I don't tone it down in that sense when I'm talking about it, but I frame it very much, and accurately, like in terms of optional ideas and things for us to think about. So, I mean, I hope we cover both. I would never, I hope, dilute the message, because the message is what it's all about, and the message is what we need to hear, at the very least, in order to get us thinking.
When Naomi and I were talking about meeting up with you, I think Naomi said that I probably disapproved of the PTMF.
You can, David, you can.
But I don't. I didn't know much about it, and now I'm full of admiration because you've produced a massive piece of work which you can really be proud of.
Thank you. Now you can read it and see if you still think that.
It's good to hear about all of the work that you're involved in, actually. And I think you're also involved with MAD in the UK.
I am involved with MAD in UK, a blog site, and that's a sister site to MAD in America, which that's a kind of journalistic site, if you like. Articles, podcasts, blogs, and MAD in America has a presence now in 14 countries, so I've been involved in the MAD in the UK version. I'm also involved in quite an active campaign about ECT, officially about, better standards, safer regulation of ECT, compensation for those damaged by it, and so on. So I have a finger in quite a few pies.
Yeah, all really interesting stuff, and we'll share links to all of that. I was also thinking when you were talking about the involvement for organisations, and obviously this week we've seen the Telegraph really with a campaign of really exposing the extent of silencing of staff working for the NHS with all their coverage of whistleblowers. I'm thinking it would be really great if the NHS thought about the PTMF in terms of staff and patient safety, really, actually to do something in a more meaningful way, rather than the tokenistic speak-up process as it currently exists. I'm sure that PTMF could be utilised to some degree.
Well, that's a big power issue, isn't it? Yes, silencing. That's power at work. Yes.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It'd be great to think that the PTMF could have some helpful influence there.
So, Lucy, we're coming to the end of the conversation, but if you were to give our listeners any advice to follow in terms of how to maintain their well-being, what would you be offering up?
Don't take me as a role model. I do spend too much time on this stuff. I try to keep a balance. What can I say? I try to keep a balance. I do all the things you'd expect some of my age and background to do. I do yoga, I go swimming and running. I swam throughout the winter this year, twice a week in a lake. I'm very proud of that. For me, that's a bigger achievement than writing an academic document. Writing an academic document is comparatively easy. But swimming in temperatures of 4 degrees was very much out of my comfort zone. But, I have family, I have friends, I have a very full life. So I try not to let it be dominated by work stuff.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming on, Lucy.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Great to meet you.
You too.